Biology video, Mr. Phillips, and today we're continuing the Ecosystems and Energy module for A2 Biology, looking at the phosphorus cycle. So we'll get straight into it. Not a long lesson really, this one, but one that's important and could quite easily link in a big essay question. So the reason I'm saying it could link in a big essay question is because of the uses of phosphorus. Biological importance of phosphorus is something you may have overlooked when studying the content, because obviously you haven't looked at it massively in until this point where we get it from. But phosphorus is used, if you think about it, you've talked about in the actual structure of the cell, the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so the membranes, every single membrane of a cell is linked to phosphorus. The fact that it's they have phospholipids have a hydrophilic head, hydrophobic tail, gives the membrane its structure and its properties. So if you did get an essay question on something to do with phosphorus, or describing, how organisms gain it and why it's important, you'd talk about the phosphate cycle, which we're going to talk about, and then you would talk about the actual uses of it. So you talk about the membrane, the phospholipid bilayer. You'd also talk about DNA, because if you remember the structure of DNA, has a organic base. Okay, so nitrogen containing organic base. It has a pentose sugar, and then we've got a phosphate group. Okay, so we've got the phosphate up there. Okay, and ATP. Okay, so our energy source for every living thing is adenosine triphosphate. So don't call them phosphorus, they're phosphates because they're oxygen and phosphate. And the breaking, don't forget, of that bond there between to make it ADP releases 30 kilojoules of energy per mole. So that shows you've got a massive use of phosphate that we've already covered, and there's one or two more you'll probably do in the rest of your course. But let's keep going on and actually look at the phosphate cycle, the phosphorus cycle. Okay, now effectively all you need to know is this: so it's not a difficult cycle at all, nothing compared to the nitrogen cycle. So whenever you do, you always want to start in the rocks. Okay, so we start in the rocks of the ecosystem, and we've got phosphate in the rocks. And rocks, as you should know from early on geography or chemistry you did it in school, the rocks break down, they get eroded as a result of weathering. So the rocks get weathered, that releases phosphates into the soil as the rocks break down. They will then get absorbed, but we should always be talking about phosphate. Okay, so we should never really mention the word phosphorus in the cycle, because it's always phosphate, always attaching itself to another element. So the phosphate is then in the soil, that gets absorbed by producers, so the plants in the soil. If we're in water, it'd be like the seaweed or the algae in the water, or the organic aquatic plants, I suppose. That then gets passed along the food chain, so we go to your primary consumers, your secondary consumers, as they eat the plants, and then they get eaten themselves. And one of the two things will happen: either the phosphorus will be released as phosphate in the urine or the feces of the organism, or the organism will die, and therefore it gets broken down by the saprobionts in decomposers. And then that again releases it back into the soil, and as a result it could re-enter the cycle. And obviously in theory it could end up as sedimentary rock as well, and get locked up in rocks over millions of years. So let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail then, and have an idea of some questions that you could be asking. So how does phosphate in the rocks end in the soil? Well, that's what we just talked about here in this stage. That would be some form of weathering, and we don't need to worry about the different types of weathering. You're not in year 7 doing science, but if you remember, there's freeze-fall weathering where it gets hot and cold, breaks rocks down. There's chemical weathering, and then I suppose if you're in a river, it would be the water constantly acting on it. Next one, how do plants absorb phosphate from the soil? Well, hopefully that's pretty obvious. They absorb it through the root hair cell when they absorb via active transport. So don't forget that idea of active transport is needed to absorb it. And plants have mycorrhiza, which, if you remember, a mycorrhiza is a fungus that forms a symbiotic relationship with some plants. They would be able to absorb more phosphate than others. Okay, so that's really, really useful to remember from the lesson we did on the nitrogen cycle, that you can go back and look at. Next one, number 3, what organisms would decay dead organisms or take them back to the soil? So that would be your saprobionts, which is generally bacteria and fungus. Okay, but saprobionts, if you remember, they feed on the remains of dead organisms to make their own energy, and they will release the inorganic molecules back into the soil. So they're releasing the phosphates back into the soil. Next one, number 4, what happens to the phosphate that gets washed off land into rivers? So the leachate that comes off the land into rivers will be absorbed by the aquatic plants through the roots. And then how does phosphate sometimes end up in, can't read what that question says, so I can't tell you what it is. Don't know where it ends up, and I don't know what the question says, so we'll leave that one for a minute. We'll come back to that one hopefully in a minute. So here's an example of a chain, of a food chain. So if we just look at these questions again, how does the herbivore get the phosphorus from the rocks? Well, if you're asked the question like that, you'd have to say, well, the phosphorus from the rocks enters the cycle because it gets broken down via weathering that releases phosphate ions. The phosphate ions are then absorbed by the plants, and then the herbivore is the primary consumer that eats the plants, or the producer. Give 2 ways in which the herbivore would use phosphate. So we've just given those. I'll give you 3. Cell membranes, phospholipid bilayer, ATP generation, and in their DNA. And then why does this cycle rely on the saprobionts? Because the saprobionts break down the dead waste, the dead animals and plants, and the waste, the feces and urine of the plants, to return the phosphate ions back into the soil so they can be reabsorbed by the plants and recycled around. So if you were asked a question like this then, so describe how phosphorus is passed through this ecosystem as an 8-mark question. Let's say, how would you answer it? Well, these are the things you need to put in. So the phosphate ions in the rocks are released through weathering. The plants absorb via roots, and mycorrhiza can greatly increase that absorption. And you might want to explain that mycorrhiza are a symbiotic fungus that live on the roots of the plants to increase the surface area, which greatly increases the absorption. The phosphate ions are passed along the food chain from the producer, the plant, to the primary consumer, to the secondary consumer, to however far you go. Then they'll be lost from the animal's waste products, but also if the animal or plant dies, that returns it to the soil, because the saprobionts, which is the bacteria and algae that decompose the dead organisms and the waste as well, they're using it to respire with, and they release the phosphates back into the soil. Remember, I'm saying phosphates all the time here. The plants then will reabsorb through the roots, and again mycorrhiza will absorb better, and the whole process starts again. Now if you do have rocks in aquatic environments, so lakes and the sea, this will also just release nitrates into the water, and that will just pass again from the food chain. So you see on this picture, from the algae to the aquatic animals, and go through there. And the same thing still happens, is that it will end up being decomposed and just returned around. Now seabirds eat obviously a lot of sea animals, and you find that the food, the waste, the guano as it's called, which is basically feces of seabirds, has high levels of phosphate in them, and as a result the coastal areas often have this, and they'll use it as natural fertilizer. So the question different though here is, if we actually said about this ecosystem, what would you say? Well, you need to talk through the exact example. So if you look, what you would start with is the rocks in the middle, because every single time you describe this, you want to talk about your rocks, and I've got images of the rocks on land and in the water here. So the thing is, you just say the same thing. Phosphate ions in the rocks are released through weathering into the lake and into the soil. Okay, so we've got them coming out here into the water, but then we've got them going into the soil as well. Okay, now obviously same thing happens. The producers absorb it, the plants absorb it via the roots, and the mycorrhiza increase that. So that's either going into the plants like the trees, or it's going into the seaweed at the bottom here. The phosphate ions then just pass along the food chain. So this one will be through the aquatic animals to the fish, okay, and on the land you've got from like the trees and the bushes into the deer there, which is the herbivore. Then it's lost through animals' waste products. So anyone who has a fish tank knows that fish often have poo trailing behind them, and that is their waste, okay, and obviously the deer is going to be pooing and weeing as well. When the animals die, or when the waste, then it gets decomposed, so that could either be again in the soil, in this case up here, or it could be in the water, in this case up here, and it's decomposed by saprobionts, which are bacteria and fungi. That then returns the phosphate back into the water in the case of the aquatic system, and that'll obviously eventually get back down to the soil, the water bed, if you say, and that's reabsorbed. In the food chain on the land, that will end up back in the soil, and if it ends up back in the soil, then it can either be reabsorbed into the trees, or it can leach off the land in a process called leaching, which makes it enter the water cycle, or sorry, the aquatic